to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
My guest for episode 90 of the Leo Training Podcast is senior SFG Brandon Hetzler. Brandon is a certified athletic trainer who serves as the manager for Mercy Sports Medicine in Springfield, Missouri, where he oversees the sports medicine program as well as the sports performance program. He has recently co-authored 2 ebooks along with Jeff O'Connor titled The New Language of Movement, Volume 1, The Push-Pull Strategy, and The New Language of Movement, Volume 2, The Symmetrical Stance Strategies. In addition, he was responsible for helping to formulate the curriculum for the sports medicine and athletic training programs at Missouri State. In this interview, we discuss several topics, including the neurodevelopmental sequence and motor control skill acquisition, his article for Strong First titled A Long Way to Press, Work Capacity, Levers, and Tall People, and the 2 ebooks that I mentioned earlier. So without further ado, let's roll to episode 90 with Brandon Hetzler. I'm very excited to welcome Brandon Hetzler onto the Leo Training Podcast. Brandon, I appreciate you being patient with me as I get up to speed here in my new surroundings in Kansas City. So it's very cool to kind of have you, right down the road, so to speak. But looking forward to finally sitting down with you and chatting about some of the topics we got down. So thank you so much and welcome.
No problem. Thanks for having me. I'm always excited when we can save somebody from one of the coasts and bring them to the Midwest where all of us good folks are. So.
That's right. Yeah. It's been a change in culture and stuff, but it's definitely, it's been very welcome, and everybody here is very, very friendly, and definitely much more consistent sunshine, not so many gray skies in the Northeast.
Well, you say that, and we're in the middle down here of a cold front. It's only getting into the 80s right now, so
it's terrible. It's
terrible. Horrible. It's fall weather.
It's awful. Oh man. So before we launch into our topics, I got a pretty eclectic audience made up of the strength and conditioning community as well as the endurance community. So why don't you take a couple minutes, introduce yourself, let folks know a little bit about your education, your background, kind of the populations that you work with in terms of coaching, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay. It's not super exciting, but now I classically trained as an athletic trainer. Got my degree in sports medicine back in the early 2000s. From there, spent 2 years in grad school at Oklahoma State, where got my master's degree in human performance. Spent a couple years with the football team there, worked with several of the athletes, all across OSU athletics. Then from there, I was privileged to end up at the Olympic Training Center out in Colorado Springs, where as a fellowship athletic trainer, that's just a nice word for you're here and you're going to work the whole year. Spent a year in Colorado, never once went skiing because I had it so busy. But, as at the time it was perfect because, just straight out of school, they actually gave me a paycheck. So I thought that was awesome. Lived at the base of Pikes Peak and worked about 80 hours a week. I thought I was living the perfect life. Got to work and see several of the Olympic teams. Spent a lot of time with the weightlifting team, and then somehow I got into the combat sports, wrestling, judo, taekwondo, and then helped out with whatever other teams were on the complex for the day. And then from there, I was able to get back to the Midwest, where moved here to Springfield, started working at a sports medicine clinic as an athletic trainer doing rehab, which is kind of a unique situation. We're one of the only actual therapy clinics that I'm aware of in the U.S. where we have athletic trainers that are in a rehab role billing for their services. There's a few others out there, but we've been doing it for 25 years now. Spent a year here, then had to move to Oklahoma to get married, where moved back to Stillwater. Spent 4 or 5 years there. I worked, it's kind of a jack of all trades there. Worked for a hospital system. They hired me to get a sports performance and sports medicine center up and running. And after 2 years, we realized that our visions were a little bit, my vision and the corporate vision were a little bit opposite of each other. So we decided to cordially part ways. So I started working for a video software analysis company called DartFish, where I had the, in hindsight, I had the privilege of being able to go around and work with several university athletic programs. I got University of Arkansas set up with their video software program in the weight room. Kansas State, University of Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma State, Oklahoma. So I was able to get around to a lot of the Big 12 schools and see how they do things and interact with a lot of their strength coaches. And, all the time trying to pick up a little bit here, a little bit there. And then we had the opportunity to move back here to Springfield. My wife got a job at the university. They decided to bring me back on at the hospital again at the same facility I was out with before. So started there doing rehab. Then after about 3 or 4 years of doing that, our strength and conditioning coach, we also have a sports performance program that runs in tandem to our rehab program. Our strength and conditioning coach decided to up and move to Kansas City. So he's up there where you're at. And they asked me if I would take the sports performance side over on a temporary basis. And I asked them what I'd get out of that. And they pretty much said I'd get to play with kids and work with kids all day. And that was about it. So took that over. And from a temporary standpoint, that turned into a 5-year gig. Then about 2 years ago, I transitioned out of that into the management role. So I now oversee the whole facility over the rehab side, over the sports performance side. Somewhere along the lines, we started a master's program here at the university. My wife's the department head for the sports medicine department at Missouri State. And about 6 years ago, they tasked her with starting a master's program, a master's of athletic training. And at the time, education-wise and athletic training, things have changed just a little bit over the last couple of years. But at the time when you started a master's program, in order to get approval, you had to have some area of specialty. And so she looked around and she decided what she wanted their department specialty to be was leadership and movement. And so she came to me and a couple people that I work with and asked us if we'd be willing to sit down and design a graduate level curriculum for a movement-based approach into clinical rehab. And obviously, we jumped all over that. So we basically sat down and we created the program that we wish we'd been able to go through as athletic training students in graduate school.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, she gave us some, I guess that is one of the benefits of being married to the department head, but she gave us, basically she took over, she and a couple of other people took over the leadership aspect of it, the leadership coursework and all of that. So they put all that together. They asked us to put together the clinical side of things, and we pretty much had free reign to put together whatever we wanted. So we sat down and we designed a graduate program that went from a real world review of anatomy to movement assessment to how to integrate, exercises and hands-on manual work into strength and conditioning. Put that all on paper. She took that to the university. They liked it. The university took that to the State Board of Regents because we're a state school and they liked what we did. And we just are next Tuesday, we start our 6th or 7th grad school class. So we've been doing it now for 6 or 7 years. So, it's probably one of the things I am the most proud of is having the opportunity to corrupt these grad students' mind at such a young age so that then anybody else that's coming in behind me, they have a lot to overcome. So make it tougher on them. But we were able to get that up and going. And, the nice thing about that is that helped us from, we had to put all of our thoughts and all of our ideas and everything on paper, which has helped us from a clinical standpoint, probably more than what it's helping from a grad school standpoint. Along the way, when I was back in Stillwater, Oklahoma, I had the opportunity to volunteer at a couple high schools, on the strength and conditioning side, which is kind of what got me going with that. Started training kids then kind of on my own, didn't really have a clue what I was doing. And in hindsight, I'm like, wow, got lucky there. And, I've been training kids, youth athletes, ever since the early 2000s. And even today, not as much today since I'm a little bit more on the management side of things, but still get the opportunity to go out on my terms when I decide there's somebody out there that I want to work with, somebody I want to train, or something I need to do. So that's what's got me to where I'm at now. So
that's awesome. That's really cool. Sounds like you've had some just amazing experiences, and got to travel around a little bit. Being at the Olympic Training Center, and then coming back into Missouri and helping develop that curriculum and everything too, and then now getting to work with youth athletes.
Yeah, back when I was, an athletic training student at Missouri State, which at the time was Southwest Missouri State, if somebody would have told me that, the countless hours you're going to stand out on the football field watching football practice, or on the basketball court watching basketball practice, or at the track watching the track athletes run around the track. If anybody would have told me then that, sitting there watching all of these hours at some point later on would actually be a benefit for you, I'd have thought they were lying. But, as an athletic trainer, one of the things that we do is, we actually go out, we're the one healthcare profession that goes out to where, the injuries and the accidents happen, and just wait for it to happen, similar to EMS, just in the world of athletics, and so we spend countless hours at practices, just watching. And, the benefit, it took me a while to see the benefit in that, but, all the different sports I've worked, the typical team sports, but then also with USOC, a lot of the individual sports, a lot of the lesser known sports, being able to sit down and watch all of those, and, then look back and see all of the commonalities among those sports, in hindsight, that's actually helped quite a bit, because, Jeff and I just had a little discussion yesterday morning about sport specific training, and kind of gotten to the point now where, sport specific, I don't necessarily know that I'm on the fence. We'll just say I'm on the fence with it, because from my viewpoint, my vantage point, I see more similarities among all the different sports than differences. And I think part of that's come from my, being there for all these different sports, seeing all these different sports, and being able to take those commonalities away from them into the rehab world, into the performance world, so that, we can train and work on what these kids and what these athletes are actually having to do in their sport, without getting into the sport specific skills and anything like that. So huge benefit now that I wish I would have taken more advantage on 10, 15 years ago. But
yeah, but that's pretty amazing. Just, having that ability to sit in on all the games or the practices and stuff. And then, God forbid something does happen, you're there, but you're seeing really, the movements that they're using, or perhaps the compensations or things that these athletes may need to work on. And then, when you have the ability to work with them in the gym setting, you're kind of that much more informed about what they really need.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, in all the different sports that I've covered, all the different coaches that I've worked with, almost every practice starts the same way, regardless of what the sport is, regardless of if it's a team sport or if it's an individual sport, if it's popular, if it's not, no matter what, at the highest levels, almost every practice begins with some kind of refresher or getting back to the fundamentals or the basics. Even they might call that a warm up, but it's all these basics. It's the same sports skills you're teaching your 6 and 7 year olds. And they, even the best of the best, the Olympic level, professional level, the collegiate athletes, every day they're going back and they're dialing back into these basics. And I think that's what a lot of kids and a lot of coaches don't understand and see. they see all these fancy drills and all this, all this flashy stuff, and that's what they want to do, but they don't realize that, before they get to that, they spend hours and hours and hours on the fundamentals and the basics. And even at the highest levels, they still get back to that. And so, I'd say the bulk of what I do in both the rehab world and in the strength and conditioning world is forget the fancy stuff. Let's just get good at the basics. What are the basics that you need to do from just from a lifting standpoint? What are the basics you need to do from a movement standpoint? What are the basics that you need to do from just being a human standpoint? Let's get good at that. And then once we get good at that, then let's have that next conversation about what comes next. Right. And I can't say, in all the kids I've trained over all the years, that what comes next conversation, we don't have that too often, because it's just a lot of getting good at the basics, and then they go to their sport, and that sport's where they then connect the dots and do all the fancy stuff. Right. There's nothing more sport specific than going to basketball practice. So, we try to get them to where, my philosophy, my goal has always been to, you finish our program, you spend enough time with us. My goal is that when you go to your practice, you have all the building blocks and all the foundations that you can get into whatever position, whatever posture, whatever weird angle that you need to do to be successful at your sport and learn that skill without having to spend a lot of time, a lot of remedial time, because you can't get into a good ready position or a good defensive position, or you're so focused on that you can't focus on the skill that the coach is trying to layer on top of that.
Yeah. So, kind of building off of that, do you want to talk a little bit about, I guess how you go about evaluating or kind of identifying the starting point for the individual?
Yeah, that's something that, if you'd asked me that conversation a year ago, I think I'd had a completely different answer than what I do now. I guess it depends if we're talking on the rehab side or on the performance side. On the performance side, what we try to do is we just try to see every kid that walks in our door. Typically, the common presentation is they have a parent that knows exactly what their kid needs. And I value that information, but it does that, what that parent says the kid needs, or what that, that sport coach says that the kids needs. I take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, because, I have a 7-year-old and he is the greatest football, soccer player, basketball athlete on the planet at 7 years old. So, my perspective on how good he is probably a little bit skewed from what reality actually is. So anytime a parent comes in and tells me a story about their kids, I kind of view it through that lens, the lens of a parent. They're probably close, but they're probably not hitting the nail right on the head. And there's probably some things that they're missing. So what we try to do is we try to create a complete profile of that athlete so that we can actually see what's going on with them. We from an athletic standpoint, we go back and we want to see how well they move. So we take them and we put them through some stuff, and we create a nice movement profile. I can't think of many sports where you don't have to be able to generate some level of power and then be able to control some level of power. So we take them through an athletic assessment. We look at how they jump. We look at how they land. We measure all of this stuff. We measure their speed. We take them through a couple agility drills. We do some baseline strength testing. And then depending on what sport they play, we might go a little bit deeper into that world. And then we just try to get an overall well-rounded idea of what they're good at and what they're not good at. And then we take that combined with what their goals are to come up with what it is we really need to do with them to kind of fill those gaps so that they can, reach the goals that they have, in their chosen sport. I'd hate to think how many kids we've taken through and run an FMS on over the past 7 years. The formal FMS used to be our entry point into every conversation we had with those kids. About a year ago, we've modified that. We're now using just bits and pieces of the FMS to kind of help us create that. And we've kind of snuck some other things in there to kind of fill some gaps and, try to get an overall idea of how that person moves in regards to what it is we're looking at. And then we just kind of go from there. From a rehab standpoint, surprisingly, it's the same, just scaled a little bit differently. It's a little bit tougher when somebody's coming in with an ACL injury. And, coming off of coming off of ACL surgery, how do we create that profile for them? And in reality, I think that's a whole lot easier because you're dealing with a situation where you know exactly what's been done. We have range of motion benchmarks we have to get to. We have some very simple things that we have to get to. Things don't get too complicated until much later on. So we take them through the exact same thing once we get a little bit later in time. And then I think one of the things that we have taken from the rehab world over to the performance world is that range of motion. I think that's one thing that, kind of gets overlooked. And, one of the things that we really emphasize is if somebody doesn't have a complete range of motion, then how can we expect any pattern to be good?
Right.
It's just like if we're trying to have a conversation and we only know half of the alphabet. We've already cut how many words we can put together easily in half, if not a little bit more, because we've taken away half the words. So, we've kind of adjusted our aim just a little bit to kind of get a little bit better idea of some of those range of motion benchmarks that we know that are out there, kind of integrate all that together.
So that's using kind of all of those different variables to come up with kind of a complete movement profile. So you'll take, range of motion benchmarks, whether they're on the rehab side or on the like sports performance side, and make sure that they kind of have some of those baselines covered. And if they don't, then obviously, especially on the sports performance side, they're going to have a lot of difficulty getting into the right position or right posture during the sport.
Absolutely. Now, when I say range of motion, we don't lay anybody down on a table and pull out the goniometer or the inclinometer and actually start measuring numbers. That's on the rehab side we do. And really, in all honesty, the only reason we do that is so we can document for insurance. But we've kind of identified some classic positions, some classic. I think the word Kelly Starrett uses in Supple Leopard is archetypes. So why recreate the wheel? So we just start calling them archetypes. Some of those classic archetypes people get into, you have to have certain range of motions to be able to get into that. So we've kind of just taken that, reverse engineered it back to some minimal positions that people should be able to get into that maximize their range of motion and just look at can they or can't they? And then it becomes a simple yes they can, no they can't. And then we kind of go from there. And if it's a no, they can't, then we make note of it. We move on. And then at a later point in time, we might dig a little bit deeper into what's limiting that range of motion. Is it a soft tissue? Is it a tissue quality issue? Is it more of a neural tension issue? Do we have something going on at the actual joint capsule? Is it something? Is there some swelling going on? Do they have some scar tissue? What's that limitation? We don't necessarily get into that day one, but in order to separate that out and clean that up as quickly and efficiently as possible, we need to know what's causing that, Sure. Because that then decides, are we going to layer on some mobility drills for this person, or do we need to get in there and have you do some soft tissue work on your own to take that off the table? Or if it's a neural tension issue, do we need to kind of get in and work on central nervous system and get you to kind of dial things back and get you to relax a little bit to, dial down some of that neural tension, and then get into some stuff. So that's not necessarily day one stuff, but that is stuff that we try to tease out after we've identified an issue with somebody. Yeah,
that's great. So could you kind of give, like the audience an example, of, just a range of motion, neural tension, or soft tissue, like kind of, 3 different scenarios where, maybe it's like active straight leg raise or push up or something like that, where you're working on the same pattern or the same type of movement skill. But each of those 3 variables is different and how you would address them is different.
Absolutely. One of the things that we look at is it's not a toe touch, but we'll just say a toe touch. We'll just say we're looking at the toe touch. Somebody can't touch their toes. That could be something. There could be some posterior chain, anywhere from the Achilles all the way up to the base of the skull. Some actual muscular shortness in there, some tissue shortness in there. You could have a situation where, because of maybe this person sits at their desk all day, or they're driving a truck all day, they're in a seated posture all day. They might have some issues with, we'll just use the word, the sciatic nerve, get stuck in that shortened posture all day. That nerve, that's not going to slide and glide the way that it needs to around and over and through some of the muscles. So you're going to get some tension there. How that person presents is they're just not going to be able to touch their toes. It could be something where they have a capsular restriction at their hip, where they're not able to get into a good hip flexed position, which as soon as that locks down, now, we're going to achieve that hip flexion, because that hip flexion is going to move up to the lumbar spine. So somebody can't touch their toes. First thing we do, we change it up just a little bit. We ask them to do more of a standing hip flexion drill, where lumbar spine stays neutral, and we'll cue them on that. And then I just want to, with their knees straight, how far can they flex their hips? If they can't get to 90 degrees, then what I'll do is I'll put them down on the ground, lay them with their feet up on the wall, and look to see if they can get to 90 degrees there. So if somebody's standing up and they can't get their hips flexed to 90 degrees, we lay them down, all of a sudden they can get their hips flexed to 90 degrees. We know we've taken the tissue off the table, meaning it can't be a pure muscular tightness issue, because if it were, they'd be tight when we lay them down on the ground. So now we've narrowed it down to either a CNS issue. Maybe there's just too much tone in the nervous system. Or maybe they actually have a capsular restriction at the hip. So if I put them up on the wall and all of a sudden they get to 90 degrees, then what we'll do is we'll sit them up and we take them through we apply a clinical drill, which is called we've modified a little bit the slump drill, a slump test, to just basically test to see that sciatic nerve down into the lumbar plexus. We look at that slump drill to see if they have any increased symptoms on one side versus the other. And then if they don't, then what we do is we actually lay them down on the table and actually look at the range of motion of that hip. Do they have 120 degrees of hip flexion, actively and passively? 2 minutes, and we've gotten with that quick little 2-minute evaluation, we've now decided, okay, is this a tissue issue where we need to apply some good mobility drills, maybe integrate some loaded stretching, some loaded mobility work? Is it an issue where they're just bringing too much tone to the table through their CNS, where we need to maybe get in and do some soft tissue work to activate that parasympathetic nervous system, get to dial things down? Or is it a situation where they actually have a capsular restriction at the hip? Especially, now since so many people spend all day sitting just because of commutes to work, that's what job requires, the body is going to respond to that. We see a lot of things happening from that. Do they just have a pure capsular issue that we need to get in and really get after that and clean that up to take that off the table? 2 minutes and we'll have the exact answer and kind of go from there. So
there you go. Measure twice, cut once.
Well, I wish I could apply that at home. All the stuff I do here, I do the opposite. But at work, I tend to get that right most of the time. So,
well, yeah, I'm still learning. It's really cool to hear you talk about all this, because it's very clear and concise. Like you sound like you kind of have everything. You're able to drop it into buckets and very proficiently kind of identify all these different variances in how somebody's moving. And you know where to go.
Yeah, and that's one of the nice things about our performance program is really, it becomes a petri dish. We've done a lot of stuff with different organizations that have wanted to test out this process, that process, this assessment, that assessment. And the volume of kids and the volume of athletes that we have walk through our doors over the course of the month, we're able to get enough data and feedback back that typically in most facilities it would take 6 months, a year to get that kind of volume. So we're able to take stuff and apply it on our performance side of things and get a really quick answer, get a really quick idea. Does this work? Does it not work? Is it something that we need to improve, or do we just need to go back to the drawing table? So, the nice thing about it is, again, just because of our volumes, we're able to tease things out so much quicker and cut that learning time in half if not even more, just because of how many kids we have come through and how easily it is for us to integrate everything together and see, does it work, does it not work? So helps us speed the process up quite a bit.
Yeah, you're getting a lot of feedback and data to go along with it. That's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. So
very cool. So kind of shifting gears a little bit. So, do you want to talk about how the movement restoration project started, and then also movement outlaws?
Sure. Kind of about the time that my wife asked me to develop that master's program, we had just had our first child, which was the exact same time that the hospital asked us to sit down and create a rehab curriculum, which was at the exact same time that I had just finished training and completed my first RKC course. So we sat down and
So you weren't busy at all?
Oh, not at all. No. I think my motto at the time was sleep was optional. So 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there. I got a full hour. It was amazing, but that's what they make coffee for, right?
Yeah.
Now all of that it was a perfect storm. All that came together at once, and we realized that all these different things that were coming together, again, going back to, instead of looking at differences, let's look at the similarities. All that stuff that was happening at the same time, it was one problem. And so we sat down and we were able to answer all of those issues, to create the master's program, create the rehab curriculum. We were all able to answer all those at the same time, and that morphed into movement restoration. And what movement restoration is we just basically took all of the resources that were out there, and we just tried to tie it all into one simple resource that went covered the span of human development, which is just, oftentimes you hear the word human development and we think of the milestones, and the milestones is, I'd say that's just a tip of the iceberg, but that's still giving it too much credit. We ran the gamut of human development into movement assessment. How do we apply that clinically? How do we reverse engineer that back from a rehab standpoint? How does that actually articulate into the world of formal anatomy and formal physiology? And then we were able to blend that in with what I had just taken away from my RKC experience and integrate all of that together. And we came up with this curriculum that, we were able to turn into our graduate curriculum as well as our rehab curriculum for the hospital. But then what we realized as I was going out and, doing a lot of stuff at the time, this RKC course, that RKC workshop, talking to a lot of people, telling them what I was doing, they're like, man, that sounds like something I would love to go to and go through. How do I do it? I'm like, easy. You either come work for us at the hospital or you come to grad school at Missouri State. Well, not a lot of people want to come to Missouri for grad school if they're already into a career and have a master's degree. So that's when a couple of people I work with that were working on all this at the same time with me, we decided to go ahead and take a step out there and create movement restoration, which is where we go out and, we go into physical therapy clinics, sports medicine departments, and essentially take all that stuff from our graduate course, our 2-year course, and we've refined it down to a 2-day process on how to apply that clinically. From, our first workshop we did out at UCLA, we spent 4 hours, and I apologize for it now. We spent 4 hours just talking about human development. A little bit of overkill. We've refined that down now to, out of a 2-day course, we spend the first 4 hours in lecture, and the next day and a half is all hands-on application of all of that. All the way from, why is crawling important? Why, if your goal is to get stronger, why is upper body extension the entry point into that? We put all that together with movement restoration, and then, where from a rehab world in the physical therapy, physical rehabilitation world, that kind of ended once we started to have the conversation about strength training. Just because in the rehab world, once you've gotten to where you've gotten a nice foundation of strength, typically that patient walks out the door because insurance has done pain or they're back to their activity. But we were really just scratching the surface with that. And that's where, some work that Jeff O'Connor and I had done, over the past 5 or 6 years, we were able to integrate that to where that led to what's now called Movement Outlaws, where we now pick up that conversation at the strength and conditioning part and move forward. And how do we integrate that into training somebody to be an athlete? And how do you then take that into how do you train kids? How do you train youth athletes? How do you train teams? So really Movement Outlaws is kind of the next step from movement restoration, where movement restoration is more of the clinical approach, the clinical application, and Movement Outlaws is more of the performance-based approach of the same philosophy. So same discussion, just scaled a little bit different on the continuum.
Yeah, that's very cool. That's very cool. So how has that kind of evolved? Obviously you both just kind of released that first ebook. Mm-hmm. I guess, was it last month?
It was July. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I got to check.
July.
I don't even know what month it is right now. So
yeah. It's all running together.
So you released that first ebook. It's titled "The New Language of Movement, Volume 1: The Push-Pull Strategy." Mm-hmm. And then I believe Jeff had hinted out that you guys are working on the second volume, I think, which you said is going to be released shortly. And that what will that one focus on? Volume 2?
Volume 2, I think the day you did your podcast with Jeff, he and I were filming the video for that one.
Oh, cool.
He kicked me out the door because he said he had a podcast to do, and I thought he was joking with me because he's not. It's like, you don't even know what podcast means. Come to find out, he was actually telling me the truth. So, we shot that video back in July for Volume 2. We haven't officially released it, but it is up on the iTunes store right now. And hopefully in the next couple of days, after I've gotten some feedback from some people, I'll actually make a formal release of that. Kept the same title, just changed it to Volume 2, and it's a deadlift and squat strategies. Basically what we've decided to do with, the New Language of Movement series is, there's what's commonly been referred to as the 7 fundamental patterns of human movement, which, push, pull, hinge, squat, rotation or twisting, a lunge, and then locomotion or gait. And so, Jeff and I sat down and started looking at those. And if you look at them, just like we laid out in Volume 1, the push and the pull, from an exercise standpoint, exercise-wise, they look completely different. But if you get down and look at it from a developmental standpoint, there's a lot of commonalities between the push and the pull. Obviously, the exercises look differently, but what's actually going on from a movement standpoint is very much the same. So what we've tried to do is take that list of 7 fundamental patterns and refine that down to actually what the fundamentals are. Mm-hmm. I think one of the questions I've laid out in that first volume, we want to talk about the lunge being a fundamental component of human movement. It's like saying the car is a fundamental component of the car. But if you take away the fuel line or the spark plug, that engine doesn't work. So how can the engine be considered fundamental if there's actually building blocks that make up that engine? So we kind of took that same approach to movement. How can the lunge be considered fundamental if there are building blocks to that? And so that's where kind of the postures and patterns that we outlined in movement restoration, came into place. What are the fundamental postures that make up the deadlift and the squat? What are the fundamental patterns of stability that go into making up the deadlift and the squat? And then, like I mentioned earlier, the archetypes that Kelly Starrett laid out. What are the archetypes that make up, those patterns? And ironically, when we were looking at the push and pull series in Volume 1, the finish archetype for an overhead press is the start archetype for a pull-up. And the finish archetype of the pull-up is the start archetype of the overhead press. The only thing that changes is how gravity's orienting that weight and whether you're pushing it away from you or pulling it towards you. And so then we took that same thing, and if you look at the finish position of a deadlift and the start position of a squat, it's almost the same, other than where the bar is and what your arms are doing. But everything else is exactly the same. It's just what you do from that point. You have a few more wiggly parts with a squat, but there's a lot of commonalities between the two. volume 3, which we're already in the process of working on, and hopefully we're going to shoot the video for that in the next week or two. We're going to get in and talk about the asymmetrical stances, specifically the lunge, and then we're going to tie that into some single leg stuff and some gait work for our 4th volume. And then I think if everything goes right, we have about 9 or 10 of these that we want to get through after we've sat down and outlined it. Now, if we make it all the way through 9 or 10, who knows? We'll have to see how the first 3 or 4 go and how they're received to decide if our time and energy is worth that effort. So we'll see.
That's very cool. That's very exciting. I'm definitely looking forward to checking out volume 2 and then 3 and 4. The first one, it was I enjoyed reading it and kind of going through and how you both had kind of laid out some of the strategies in thinking about looking at the different evaluations for the push up, and then also just what you talked about, the starting and finishing position. So realizing that they're really not that far apart, and there's a lot more in common there than kind of appears on the surface.
Yeah,
it all ties back into the movement competency and the skill acquisition of the individual.
Yeah, and one of the things, in volume 2, one of the questions I lay out is, from a coaching standpoint, which do you teach first? Which do you teach a person first, a deadlift or a squat? And, obviously, depending on who coached you or who you learned from will dictate what kind of a response I get when I give you what the right answer is. And unfortunately, in the fitness world, emotions get tied into what we think, what we believe, how we teach. And so what we've tried to do is just take the emotion away from it. Let's just look at it from a movement standpoint. Which develops first, the deadlift or the squat? And if you take away, the exercise name of the deadlift or the squat, because those are the exercise names, and look at what's actually going on, both of them are occurring out of a symmetrical stance posture. So if we go back to the neurodevelopmental continuum and look at the postures, they're both occurring out of a symmetrical stance posture. So they're identical from their stances. They're both vertical. So once again, they're identical. And when we actually go in and actually start to move the bar and move the weight for the exercise, we're doing the exact same thing. We're controlling and we're coordinating weight shifts. With a squat, we have 3 weight shifts we have to coordinate. A weight shift at the knee, that's going anterior and posterior. A weight shift at the hips, which again is anterior posterior, and a weight shift at the shoulder, which is anterior posterior. As the hips move back, the shoulders and the knees go forward to kind of offset that so that we don't fall over. If that weight shift if those 3 weight shifts aren't coordinated enough, you end up falling over. The infant that's learning to stand up off the ground, they get immediate feedback. As grown-ups and as athletes, one of the early athletic trainers I worked with, Ivan Milton, one of the things he told me in class that really stuck with me is one of the reasons athletes are so good is they're so good at cheating and compensating. Not cheating in their sport, but
compensating in movement. Yeah.
Here's the task. You need to find a way. So they find a way. So as adults, we bring that same thing to us. If I can't keep my heels on the ground and squat, I'm going to find a compensation on how to get my butt low enough so that this coach isn't yelling at me. And that's going to be either rounding my back or that's going to be flaring my feet out so I can find a little bit more space in my hips. But no matter what, I'm going to get my hips below parallel. So as adults, we find all these compensations. In a deadlift, we look at it, it's the same thing. Symmetrical stance, vertical posture. But now we just have 2 weight shifts we have to control. The hips going back and the shoulders going forward. So in the squat, we have 3 wiggly parts we have to control. And in the deadlift, we have 2 wiggly parts we have to control. So from a developmental standpoint, it's a whole lot easier to learn that deadlift than it is to learn that squat. Now, unfortunately, like I said, a lot of times that emotion is tied to what we believe, and it becomes more of an emotional discussion instead of a what's actually going on discussion. And if you talk to a lot of the best coaches out there, a lot of times, I won't even say the best coaches. If you talk to a lot of coaches out there, they like teaching the deadlift before the squat because it's easier. And it's easier because there's only 2 things you have to control. There's fewer wiggly parts for that person to work around. So it makes it a whole lot easier to go from 2 weight shifts to 3. So what we've tried to do is take that same approach Jeff comes at it from his background is more in the world of strength and conditioning. My background, I got into the strength world a little bit late, and so I've had to apply a little bit more of the sciencey side to it. But we've been able to meet in the middle. How do we take all of that and apply that to where that on the ground person that has to train 8 hours a day, how can they apply this right away in a language that they're not having to learn something new? And so that's just kind of what we try to do, cut their learning curve down a little bit and give them the best information that we can, answer a lot of the questions that have been out there that, haven't been asked or haven't been answered. And how can we apply that today so that they can see a benefit right now?
Right. That's awesome. Yeah. So kind of building on what you just spoke about there. So how does that tie into, you touched on the neurodevelopmental sequence, but I guess more specifically, how does that tie into motor control skill acquisition?
Well, I mean, if you look at movement as a skill, just like look like basketball as a skill. Mm-hmm. If we look at it as a skill and refine it back to what its fundamental components are, anybody that's wanting to learn to squat, if I'm wanting to back squat, me doing that back squat is exactly the same, with body weight or double body weight on the bar. It should be exactly the same as me just standing there with no weight on the bar, which should be the same as my 7-year-old, dropping down the bottom of squat during the middle of his flag football game because he's tired. And the difference is when we get to the level of putting weight on the bar, that's the equivalent of, getting better at that sport of basketball. You're in college now. You're playing collegiate basketball instead of high school basketball, which is a little bit higher than middle school basketball. But if you look at that skill progression, that collegiate basketball player is going to have they're going to have a much more solid skill base to where they can do a lot of the fancy things on the basketball court than that high schooler or that middle school student. Same thing from a movement standpoint. I want to put weight on my back to do a squat. Well, obviously, can you do a squat without the weight on your back? And if you can or if you can't determines whether or not we should put that weight on your back or not. If you tie that into the neurodevelopmental sequence, there are certain postures that we get into that if you can't do that, that's going to make it a lot harder for you to squat. One of the ones being just straight up quadruped. Can you get on your hands and knees? And one of the ways that we look at is somebody ready to put a bar on their back and squat. I just want to see, can somebody get down into quadruped and can they squat to where their hips are, lower than their knees or behind their knees with that spine staying stable. If they don't even have the range of motion to do that there and we ask them to stand up, it's going to be a little bit tougher. If somebody's looking to lock out their deadlift, but they can't even lay on their belly on the ground in a prone position, that deadlift finish position is going to be really, really tough for them to get into. Or if they're laying on their belly and, in that prone position and their erectors are just so tight and lit up because that's the only way they can have to stabilize while they're laying on the ground. And we've got some issues with that. So we've just tried to take what we see as a skill displayed in lifting, the back squat, the front squat, the bench press, the pull up, the clean, the deadlift, the lunges, and refine that back to what those fundamental postures are that they should be able to get into easily with no effort. And we use that as our starting point. That's our foundation of skill to move forward from. And if they can, great. If they can't, let's clean it up a little bit. Let's get them into that lifting as quickly as we can, because it's nothing worse than going to the gym to lift and, they're going to make me sit down here on the pad and breathe and half kneeling for 30 minutes. I'm going to go to a different gym and pick up something heavy. Right. So we try to integrate that as quickly as we can and spend as little time not lifting as possible.
That's great. Yeah, that's very helpful. I was just taking notes there. It's good stuff to put into practice for myself and everybody I work with.
And, I think corrective exercise has become huge over the last several years. And I think there's, and rightly so, I don't want to come off as I don't believe in corrective exercise. It has its place. But one of the guys I was training for, after I went to the RKC, a couple of the people I work with, they decided they wanted to do the same thing. And one of the guys I was working with, he asked me to help program, help getting ready for the RKC. And I'm like, all right, well, tell me what your workout is. And he sat down and then proceeded to lay out what his hour-long workout was. I'm like, you didn't pick anything up. Well, I had to get warmed up and had to get ready. Took you an hour to get warmed up and loosened up, and you nailed that half kneeling position. But what's that going to do for you later? Well, I needed to clean up my dorsiflexion. And, I think sometimes the pendulum swings too far and people get so hung up that, when they come to the gym and the goal is to lift and get stronger, I actually have to lift to get stronger. People are so busy now, and especially in the world of youth athletics, we have about a window of an hour a day that we might have access to a kid, maybe 3 days a week. And if they're spending more than 10 minutes a day, going through some corrective stuff, I'm really questioning, are we doing the most that we can for them? Right. So we need to, they get a lot of homework. They get a lot of stuff they need to work on their own outside of here, trying to create some positive life habits. Because if you're going to be an athlete, it's going to take some time and dedication. It's not just show up at the field and go through the motions. If you're going to be an athlete, you need to eat right, you need to sleep right, you need to drink appropriate, get hydrated well enough. And you also need to do some self-maintenance every day, that especially on the days you're not going to come in and see us. So we try to create that positive attitude, that we try to create that lifestyle with them early on, so that they realize I'm an athlete. It takes a little bit more work for me to knock off the rust every day to be able to get out there and do what I need to do. The bad thing is, go back to when you were 17 and 18 and you could show up at the gym or show up and do whatever sport all day long, and you didn't, do the same thing the next day. But as we age, that doesn't quite happen as much, and tend to spend more time knocking the rust off to try and find a little bit of something to salvage every day. That's right. So, the goal now is with them is we just try to create that lifestyle awareness that if they're going to be an athlete, it's going to take a little bit of extra time, a little bit of extra work, and it's going to pay off later on, hopefully, for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Two kind of questions or to build off of what you just shared there. So, you mentioned you might have an hour training session to work with an athlete or a group of athletes, right? So, obviously you don't want to spend, like you just said, 45 to 60 minutes doing corrective drills. They need to get in there and they need to train. But, in terms of the warm up and raising body temperature, making sure they've got that good range of motion, soft tissues moving the way you want it. What are some things that you might be trying to integrate in that first 10 minutes of the session to kind of get them up to speed, getting them to work on that range of motion, priming the nervous system, that type of thing?
One of the things that I like to make anybody that works with me aware of are their trigger points or their junkie spots that they want to avoid and neglect. So one of the commonalities of every athlete that I've ever trained and worked with over the past 5 years is, before you come up and have a conversation with me about what we're going to do today, have you actually addressed those junkie spots? Have you spent some time, on the lacrosse ball, on a barbell, with a voodoo band, taking that off the table so that then we can have the conversation, the discussion about, let's get you warmed up to train. So that's kind of, at our facility, people just walk in the door. There's a website, I think it's called lacrosseballmonkey.com. I don't get anything from them. They probably think Southwest Missouri is a lacrosse hotbed because we literally ordered 10 cases of lacrosse balls. So 120 balls in a case. We ordered 10 cases. Do the math. That's a lot of lacrosse balls. And at the end of the year, we'll order 10 more and we give them away. And we keep them there just because we want the kid, lacrosse ball, kid can grab it, throw it in their bag, take it with them everywhere, in the car, at school, at their athletic practice. That becomes a part of their daily habit. If they lose it, we just give them another one. But people walk in our facility, we have a box of lacrosse balls, and they just grab the lacrosse ball, lay down on the mat, start taking all of that off the table, and then we get into training. And, your question about the first 10 minutes, they have their trigger points. They have their soft tissue spots that they know that they need to take off the table. They'll have one or two drills that we take them through to kind of work through some of the issues and restrictions that they might have. And then from there, we like to integrate what's going on. We treat movement as a skill. So we start with the fundamental stuff. Can we get into the archetypes of the lifts that we're going to be doing today? And it might start out unloaded and we might just gradually progress to the barbell or to the kettlebell or to the dumbbell or to the sandbag or whatever it is we're going to do today. And we might, mix in, we're going to do a set of, dowel squats, and then I want you to, jog a lap. Or let's do a set of dowel squats and go grab that light kettlebell, and we're going to do 10, 15 swings. And then we just kind of progressively work up from there. As soon as we kind of get that prepped, I like to get in and one of the focuses that we have with all of our athletes is we get in, we do a lot of deceleration work. You go to pick a practice, whatever the practice is, and they do a lot of stuff to work on power and that first step and their ability to generate speed and explosiveness, but they neglect the deceleration component. So we try to fill that gap, and we spend a few minutes every day just working on some deceleration skills. In as many different planes as possible. We try to keep it a little bit different every day for them. And then we kind of get in and work on some of the lifting skills that we'll do. And we try to integrate that as much as possible into, some of the power and the explosiveness and some of the skills that they're going to need to do. Basically, we come in, we start out simple, and we progress to a little bit more complex and complicated. Get our training done for the day. And then we wrap things up, cool things down, and get them out the door as quick as we can.
Cool. What's an example of a deceleration drill that you would have them do?
I'm sure it has a formal name. I don't know what it is. We call it a quick squat. But basically, we put everybody on it. We put them in a foot ladder. You get one little square on the foot ladder. Your feet can't land outside the black or outside the side barrier of that foot ladder. You're going to start out feet together, bouncing up on your toes. And then, depending on how busy I am for the day, either you're going to, whenever you're ready, drop into a ready position. Or when I clap, you drop into the ready position. When I give you a verbal cue, you're going to drop into that ready position. We're just trying to work on, ballistically, I won't say ballistically, but they're hopping on their toes and they have to react and they have to end up in that ready position. And then with that, we teach them to self-correct, self-spot, look down at your feet. Are your ankles touching the ground? Are your feet pointed straight ahead? Are your knees dropping inside? Get down to where they can be aware of what's going on so that they know what's good, what's bad, and they know what they need to stay out of. Teach them all those skills, and then we just gradually progress from there with them.
Awesome. Okay.
Hey, turn it down. 7-year-old daddy duty for the day. So
it's all good. Okay, so we'll kind of. Is there anything else that you want to touch on those topics before we kind of shift gears one more time?
I think the topic of deceleration. We try to integrate that as much as we can. And we do it with both body weight stuff, but we get in, and one of the things we've been able to do is we actually do that as well with some kettlebells. We try to integrate our kettlebell work with that. At our facility, we do a lot of stuff with kettlebells. Everybody at some point is doing some kind of swing almost every day. And that might just be as simple as learning how to decelerate that bell. We do a lot of stuff with the barbell working on deceleration. It's one of the reasons why, at our facility, our approach again is we want those athletes to be successful at their sport. So everybody does a deadlift. Our difference is we're not, reason that we teach the deadlift is so that we can then have that next conversation to get into a clean. And the biggest reason I like teaching people to clean is because, you have to decelerate that at the top in an athletic stance. So, if you're dealing with an athlete that's going to have to learn to decelerate any kind of load outside of there, that's one way that we're able to integrate that on the platform into their sport. So we try to find as many different unique ways to work on what's getting neglected in their sport, in their training, in any of the stuff they're doing to get better at their sport. We're trying to fill that gap. And I think, the deceleration training and the integration of that is one area that I think it's overlooked a ton. But
yeah. No, that's cool. It's very interesting to hear that, because that's the part that, that's going to exhibit whether the person has the control.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, again, going back to my, background as an athletic trainer, more often than not, when people have that non-contact injury, it's because they couldn't control things when they were trying to slow down or change directions or stick their foot in the ground and plant and cut. very rarely do we see an injury coming from the generation of power. It's that trying to control and decelerate to then change directions, plant cut, go a different direction. It's that deceleration that tends to be the problem. And again, if you can go out and you can look at all the different resources out there. There's tons of resources on how to create power, but very few on how to decelerate it. And from a training standpoint, there's very few times in sport where you're going to create power without first the ability to decelerate it and control it first. Right. Outside of the sprinter that takes out of the blocks or that Olympic lifter that's on the platform, more often than not, the expression of power in sports comes after the expression of the ability to decelerate first. So again, we just try to fill that gap as best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So final shift in topic. So, talk specifically about this article you wrote for Strong First, a long way to press, work capacity, levers, and tall people.
Oh, yes.
So we were kind of jamming on this one a little bit before we started the call. And, yeah, that article was of particular interest to me, because I'm training for the level 2 right now, but also just being somebody that's got longer arms. My arm length is longer than my height. So I can,
nice.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. So, would you kind of just talk a little bit about the article, summarize, and then, some of the, those things.
Well, anytime I can write and validate why I'm not good at something, I try to find a justification for that. So that's really where that came from. No, back, I don't even remember how long ago it was. It was at the first barbell workshop that Pavel and Doc Hartle taught in Tucson. I was there, I was going through it, and Pavel came over and was watching me do my military press, and literally my military press in that building almost hit the top of the ceiling because it was a lower ceiling. And Pavel's comment in his very thickly Russian accent was, "Oh, Brandon, you have a long way to press." I'm like, "I know, it's killing me over here. Can we change these standards?" Which they didn't. But that really kind of got me thinking of, because I'm 6'7", so, I hate ceiling fans, I hate flying, and I hate pistols. And so it really got me thinking about, how do levers play a part in that? And I do think that for those taller athletes, and not just to justify why I suck at some things, but, one of the common things that a lot of taller athletes deal with is, why does the bottom of their squat suck? Or why is it hard for them to get things overhead? Why can't I ever gain weight? And, those are some common things that we deal with all the time. And if you look at, with that article, what I sat down and tried to do was, I took one of the guys that I work with who's, for him to press from the rack position to overhead, he had to go 28, 30 inches, I believe. I don't remember exactly what it was. And then for me, it was 36 inches. So every time, if he and I pressed the same bell, every time, no matter what, I was going to outwork him. Just out of sheer, the work capacity side of things. I'm moving a bell 4 to 6 inches further every time I'm pressing it. At the end of the day, I'm going to get more work in than he is. So from a programming standpoint, kind of have to keep that in mind, especially if you're working with an athlete that is trying to put on weight or at least not lose weight. And then also from a volume standpoint, you have to keep in mind, every time, when you have somebody with those longer lever arms, that volume that's going to add up a whole lot quicker, because that's an extra 4 to 6 inches every time you're pressing a bell. Now, there are people who are going to say, well, it's all body relevant, and you're completely correct. But at the same time, the standard is I have to be able to do X. How am I going to adjust my programming? Because everybody is a little bit different. And, if I have to press the bell, 18 inches versus 36 inches, that volume, that programming is going to be quite a bit different for me. And what might work for you is not going to work for me. So really the whole premise of that was, other than to justify, why it was harder for me, was just to kind of keep in mind from a programming standpoint, we might need to adjust a few things and dial back that volume a little bit, just because each press is going to take a little bit more out of that person compared to somebody with a shorter pressing distance. And you can look at the same thing too from a deadlift or from a pistol standpoint. I hate pistols. But for me to do a pistol, I have a 36-inch inseam. It's a long way for me to drop down into the bottom of that pistol. And the dropping down is not the problem. It's that coming back up out of it. So, I mean, I think we just have to keep in mind that distance covered, it does at the end of the day add up.
Right.
And, especially if you started getting into some extended sets of I say high reps when I consider high reps anything above 5, it's going to add up a whole lot quicker for that person with the long lever arms and that person with the shorter lever arms.
Right. Right. Very cool. So that one of the other things you mentioned before we started the call was just in terms of when you were working on your press, that you actually had to keep the volume a little bit lower for you, just because of one, like you said, that the distance to overhead lockout with the bell, and just that it adds up a lot quicker.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at one of the common problems with level 2 in strong first, and it was present with the RKC, I think it's a little bit better now. You see a lot of people coming in trying to get to that press number, and a lot of times they're bordering on the side of overtraining. Mm-hmm. In order to press a lot, I've got to press a lot, and that there is a time and place for that. But at the same time, me personally, I had to press a 48 kilo bell to get that overhead, and at 230 pounds, I won't say that's super heavy, but 48 kilo bell for me is heavy, especially not having a very large background in formal strength work. Got into it a little bit late, so I don't think anybody that's ever come across me would refer to me as the strongest person in the room. Not anywhere close. I remember in college when I bench pressed 135 pounds for the first time, I was waiting for a standing ovation, but they're like, yeah, so what? You just bench pressed, 135 pounds. No big deal. It took me a little bit longer to get into that strength world. But, for me, what I found was getting that 48 overhead and doing that a lot. I could do it. But then it took me 3 or 4 days before, to come back from being able to do that. And, in a condensed time frame, it just wasn't working for me. And what I realized was if I worked on the overhead position with the bell, with the 48, push, press, jerk, whatever to get it overhead, worked on the rack position with the 48, that I could really make up a lot of that distance in between with either the 40 or the 44 kilo bell. And what I found was, and even to this day, if I can go clean a 40 kilo bell, do 5 strict presses with it, odds are in a day or two I could pick up the 48 and be able to get that press. You'd be able to get that half body weight press. If I can't press the 40 kilo bell 5 times, odds are that 48 is not going to go up for me. So I was able to, my training was a lot of low volume stuff, nothing above 5 reps. And I'd say the bulk of what I did was with the 40 or 44 kilo bell, with a little bit of work in that rack position, a little bit of work in the overhead position with the 48. And I probably went into the RK in my first level 2 course, having only pressed the 48 kilo bell, maybe a grand total of 10 times. But she was able to show up and pressed it with no problem. And more importantly, was able to go through the rest of the weekend without any shoulder issues. And, for me, it felt a whole lot better than having a lot of high volume stuff. But
Right. Absolutely. Well, that's very helpful. I'll definitely be putting that knowledge to good use here, especially in the last 6 weeks before the level 2.
Crunch time, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
No problem.
Okay, if you don't have anything else to add on that article or the press or any other topics, we can move into the rapid fire.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool. All right, so Brandon, based on all the knowledge and experience you've accumulated at this point in your career, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give yourself 10 years ago?
I would probably tell myself to be a lot more comfortable being uncomfortable. That was something that I struggled with a lot, not wanting to, kind of like what I said before, being tied into emotions with this thought, this concept, that thought, concept, not necessarily wanting to be wrong, but not even to the point, not necessarily wanting to be uncomfortable. And whether that was because, in a room where I didn't know as much as everybody else or wasn't as adept at whatever it was we were talking about, that's the one thing I would say in the last couple of years. There's not too many days where I'm comfortable, but that opportunity, that being uncomfortable, I think is what's led to a lot of, the things coming together for me. A lot of the knowledge I've been able to pick up and apply has truly come from putting myself out there and being in a position where I was uncomfortable and then able to be moving towards a point of being able to put all that together.
Very good. What is your favorite strength training exercise if you had to pick one?
Oh man. One favorite exercise, is laying on the ground, just breathing. Does that count as strength training? Because I could knock that out for days if we had to do that. No, I would probably say the snatch, whether we're talking barbell or kettlebell. And it's not necessarily my most favorite one to do, but when it comes down to I don't have much time, I need to get a lot done, that typically is what I tend to keep going back to. Nice.
How has your training changed today compared to 10 years ago?
Knocking on the door of 40, woke up this morning and was still feeling the workout that I did on Monday and realized I might have done a little bit too much. So, definitely had to get a whole lot smarter in how I train. And then also realizing that, I don't remember who said it, but it's not necessarily what you can do. It's what you can do and recover from, realizing that showing up to the gym and training isn't necessarily the best idea. And that doesn't make for the best lifestyle. I spend 10, 15 minutes a day working on stuff, if it's soft tissue, if it's some mobility stuff, that self-maintenance every day to where I can actually, when I get to the gym, can actually take advantage of the window of opportunity that I have. So I'd say I've gotten a whole lot smarter, in addressing it like more of a, I don't want to say lifestyle because that sounds kind of cheesy, but really, when I get to the gym, that's more of a summation of everything I've done up to that point and whether or not I can take advantage of everything versus not, because there's nothing worse than showing up to the gym for a squat session and having 45 minutes and it took me 30 minutes just to feel good because now I'm out of time. So right. Probably just getting smarter in how I approach things.
Awesome. Have you ever had an injury? And if so, how did that injury change your training?
Had several injuries, knock on wood, nothing that's kept me out for anything too long. Probably the one that's changed how I approach training the most, 6'7", believe it or not, for a long time, I always dealt with back issues. Got to the point for a while where I couldn't deadlift a bar, an unloaded bar, just because of the issues I was having. And surprisingly, this was right before I got introduced to the RKC and Pavel's work. And then picked up some of Pavel's stuff and got integrated into that community. And, between that and, being smart about my training, again, knock on wood, maybe once every month or two, I'll have an issue where I remember what's going on with my back and adjust things for a day or two, and I'm good to go. But completely changed how I approach training from a preparing, from a what I'm doing, from a recovery, everything. So
very cool. Here's a good one for you. What's one thing that high school athletes should be doing more of to complement their training and their health?
What should they be getting more of?
Or doing more of?
Doing more of. Part of me wants to say sleep, but then part of me also wants to say cooling down. So I'll just summarize it as recovery. Having a better recovery plan. And when I say better recovery plan, we do a great job in the industry of getting people prepared and warmed up for practice and getting things ramped up. We don't do a good job of dialing things back and getting things ramped down, as soon as practice is over to, of an evening, how much sleep they're getting.
Sure.
Research is out there showing that if you're getting less than, I think what the research says, less than 6 or 7 hours. But if you're getting less than 6 or 7 hours of sleep, you're getting cortisol is building up in your system, and cortisol doesn't do anything good for the body, especially if you're an athlete. So, I would just say having a better recovery plan from the time practice is over to sleeping to how you're putting all that together.
Excellent. Well, you kind of just answered the next question, which was, what's your best tip to improve recovery from a training session? So
put together a good recovery plan from the time practice is over to the beginning of your next practice. No, because really, very rarely, especially in the lifting world, you don't get better by what you do in the gym. You get better by how you recover from what you do in the gym. The whole reason of going to the gym to lift is to essentially break things down to create a physiological adaptation. And that how the body puts itself back together is completely based off of your recovery approach from a rest, from a hydration, from a nutritional standpoint. And I think, early on, when we're younger, we don't necessarily have that same perspective as when we're older, where we have to be more dialed in. There's no way I could afford when I was straight out of school the quality of food I have now. Being older, having a career, having a little bit of extra money in the bank, I can eat a little bit better now. But having that full understanding of how that recovery is actually going to speed up or slow down your training and speed up or slow down your goals, I think, is what most people should really spend more of their focus on instead of, and a little bit less time on what they're doing in the gym and what they're doing outside of the gym.
Excellent. So speaking of food, what's your favorite meal?
Barbecue anything.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Pick any kind of barbecue, and my wife made me barbecue some zucchini last week, and I actually didn't dislike it. So
nice.
That won't make it on that. That won't be routine. It won't be an everyday deal, but it wasn't bad. So open the door to new things. But
cool.
No, yeah.
2 more questions. What's one book everyone should read?
Natural Born Heroes.
Oh, McDougall.
Yes. Yeah, I think that one, I'd hate to think how many books I've read, but it seems like I'm always reading 1 or 2 books at a time, ranging all kinds of different things. But, how they tie in the history, how they tie in the practical concepts, A, I think it's just a good story. And B, I think there's a lot of good concepts from a training standpoint that come out of that. So I think it's a really good book.
Excellent. Final question. Who have you studied or do you continue to study from in your career to improve and get better?
I think one of the reasons that I've been able to put a lot of different things together is because who I'm studying typically changes on a fairly consistent basis. When I first got going in the RKC, I spent a lot of time studying Pavel's work. Anytime I have the opportunity to study with Pavel, take full advantage of it, and it's always been well worth the time, the energy, the discomfort, the uncomfortableness of some of his questions that it's, takes on. I had the opportunity, to spend some time early on in my career with Jeff O'Connor, Dave Whitley, Brett Jones, with some of their collaborative work, and just hearing some of the conversations that they've had. Dove really hard into a lot of McGill's work. His book, Ultimate Back Performance, I think I went through 1,000 little sticky tab notes to take notes on that one. Gray Cook, anytime he has anything that comes out, any of his books, any of his articles, I'm all over that. Recently, I've been diving into a lot of, Kelly Starrett's work over with Mobility WOD. Myrtle McGraw is actually who I've been investigating the most recently. And I will say, if you go out and look for Myrtle McGraw stuff, you won't find it because it was all published in the 1940s.
Wow.
But McGraw was one of the first ones that actually got into and looked at and made some of the first observations on human development. And one of the things I like to try and do is you hear something, let's go back to the first time it was mentioned and
source. Yeah.
And it seems like several different instances of things I came across led back to that being their source. And he published a book in the the early 1940s, and I was able to track down an original copy of that book.
Wow.
A lot of articles they have several articles that have been published from that book that's actually out in open source on the internet. But a lot of good observations that were made, 70 years ago that almost like it's reading current literature right now. So definitely on the spot with that. So I think it's something that just kind of changes depending on what my interest level is and what I'm kind of looking into, and, kind of go from there.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, Brandon, this has been a blast. I've definitely learned a lot over the last hour and change.
Hopefully it wasn't too boring.
No, not at all, man. Not at all. It was great. So thank you so much for taking the time to do it.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. Thanks for having me on here. So it was fun.
My pleasure. So just hang on the line. Let me give you a proper goodbye off air.
Okay. Perfect.
Thanks for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. Subscribe and get even more expert training tips at www.leotraining.io.